One of the things that all of us really look forward to after a hard day is being able to get some rest. Now, sometimes we may rest well at night, maybe you sleep well. Sometimes it's just being able to get off your feet and be able to sit down because you've just been on the go all day. And sometimes get very hectic. And particularly as we approach the time of the feast, that often gets to be a very hectic time. And it gets hectic, and we are looking forward to being able to rest and to relax. All of us have found ourselves in that circumstance. Some of us think we find ourselves in that circumstance nearly all the time, where we're trying to get some rest. We want to get some rest. Well, there are various kinds of rest. Certainly there's physical rest, and there's physical exhaustion, and there's being literally worn out and tired and simply needing to sit down and rest to be able to lie down and to get a good night's sleep. That physical rest is very important. There's also other types of rest, and the rest of from an emotional standpoint can also be very, very crucial. Sometimes we go through a period of time when there are seemingly intense stresses and pressures, when there are a lot of things that are upon us, and we look forward to some respite, to some let up, and we feel like I've got to have some rest. Jesus addressed that subject in Matthew chapter 11. And he said in verse 28, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Come unto me, all you that are working hard, all you that labor, that are carrying a heavy load. All of you who are exhausted, who are working hard, who are carrying a heavy load that's got you kind of bent over, come unto me, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Now, a lot of you know what a yoke is. Some of you have utilized that in times past. I have once or twice as a boy to utilize that. You know, where you yoke up horses or you yoke up mules. Many times in the past, they would yoke up oxen. It was a way of connecting these animals together so that they could pull together. Now, if the way you've got of pulling a plow or pulling a wagon or pulling a buggy or a wagon or whatever it may be, if that way is to use animals, then you want them to be able to pull together, because obviously two mules can pull a much heavier load than one mule. And in some cases, there were multiple animals that were yoked together. You know, if you've seen pictures of some of the stagecoaches of the Old West, and they weren't just of the Old West. They were, of course, the method of transportation that was used on up until the railroads came through and replaced them. That was the means of transportation. That was heavy, and they pulled it a long ways, and they pulled it over rough roads. They weren't pulling them down interstate paved highways. They were pulling them over old rutted up roads and muddy roads and up hills, and things have changed, you know, even from the time that I've heard my mother tell about years ago when her father got the first school bus in our community, and so that his children and other children around He was going to drive the school bus and and they were going to be able to go into town to school because the little country school had only gone through 7th grade. And, of course, roads weren't too good. This would have been back perhaps in late, I guess probably the late 1920s. Roads weren't much. And there was one particular area there up in the slippery red clay that, particularly when it was raining, that he had to have his son out there with a team of mules to be able to hitch to the school bus to pull it up to the top of the hill because the school bus couldn't pull the hill. All those old slippery, muddy red clay hills, the bus get bogged down, and so they had teams of mules that they would hitch to it and get it over the hill. Once it got over the hill, it could make the rest of the route. Well, the yoke is for the purpose of connecting the animals together so that they're pulling together. Because they have to be connected together by something that holds them where they're pulling together. Otherwise, if each just had its own independent line that connected to the wagon and yet they weren't connected to one another, one would go off one way, one would go off the other way. Each one would go his own direction. And everybody would be working at cross purposes. So, the purpose of a yoke is to join together all of those who are connected to the load so that their strength is combined. Their strength is combined and they are pulling together. Now, Christ talked about taking His yoke, being joined together with Him, joined together with His people, being yoked together, joined together, so that we are pulling together. Now, He said, my yoke is easy. My burden is light. Now, what did He mean by that? Sometimes we think, living the Christian life is anything but easy and light. What did Christ mean by that? Why is taking His yoke going to give us rest? What did He mean when He said, you that labor, you're working hard, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're carrying a heavy load on your back, come to me, and there you will find rest. You will find rest unto your souls. Now, what did He mean by that? We desire rest, we need rest. I would like for us to understand a little bit about that today. I think there's some very important principles that can be crucial and important in our life. Now let's go back to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 6, because Jesus' statement here, about taking His yoke and His burden and the fact that we would there find rest to our souls, was actually a quotation from the Old Testament. I think sometimes we don't realize how much of the New Testament is simply a quotation from the Old. Notice what the prophet Jeremiah said as he begins in Jeremiah chapter 6, as he is indicting the people of this nation and all of the problems and the sins of the nation. And he speaks of the indictment against the leadership in verse 13, the prophets and the priests. And in verse 14 of Jeremiah 6, he says, they have healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. This is not to say that some of the various reform movements and some of the various things that have been attempted have not done a little bit of good. Sure they have. There have been some things that have been accomplished. But Jeremiah said, under God's inspiration, they have only healed the hurt, the bruise of my people a little bit. They have done some good, yes, but it is in reality been only a tiny amount because it has not addressed the fundamental issues. It has given a little temporary relief to some of the pain, some of the problems, some of the inequities in society, but it has not addressed the fundamental problem. Verse 15, were they ashamed when they had committed abominations? No, they weren't at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they shall be among them that fall. At the time that I visit them, they shall be cast down, says the Eternal. You know, that's very descriptive of our society. That were they ashamed, neither can they blush. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible, the kind of things that we see that are just literally flaunted in our nation today that pass as entertainment. Look at the new fall lineup of television shows. Well, I'm not advising you to look at them. Maybe you look at TV Guide or right up in the entertainment section of the newspaper. I can see all I want to see of most of them there. All you need is a description. And it's absolutely incredible, some of the things that parade as entertainment, that the world thinks is funny. Funny, ha. They weren't ashamed when they'd committed these abominations. No, they weren't ashamed, neither could they blush. They've lost their ability to even be embarrassed about some of the trash and the garbage that goes on. Verse 16, notice what God says. Thus says the Eternal, stand you in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and you shall find rest for your souls. But they said, we won't walk therein. We don't want to follow the old ways, the good paths. God said, I set watchmen over you, saying, hearken to the sound of the trumpet. But they said, we won't listen. So God goes on and He describes the things that are going to come and ultimately the captivity that's going to come on this nation. Now here Jeremiah talks about finding rest for our souls, the very phrase that Jesus quoted in Matthew 11. And here Jeremiah says that the key to that is asking for the old paths and seeking the good way and walking therein. The old paths, the good way, to walk in that way. Now what does that mean? What are the old paths, the good way? Notice back in Jeremiah chapter 18 and verse 15. Again, starts out in chapter 18 talking about the fact that God is the potter and we're the clay. God is in the process of making and shaping and molding us. He is in the process of producing something. And what are we told here in verse 15 of Jeremiah 18? Because my people has forgotten me. They have burned incense to vanity. They have caused them to stumble in their ways from the ancient paths, the old paths. To walk in paths in a way not cast up. Now, in a way that's not cast up, a way that's not properly prepared. Have you ever tried have you ever been out on a hike, going through a rugged area, and somehow gotten off the trail, gotten off the path? And you find as you do that the going gets harder and harder. Because the path is not cast up, it's not prepared, it's not cleared. It's not a way of easy transit. No, you wind up having to go through briars and with limbs blocking your way, and sometimes old rotten logs across the path, sometimes rocks, sometimes various things that roots and everything sticking up. It can be very difficult. It's easy to stumble. It's hard going. When you get off the path into a way that is not cast up. Now that expression simply means a way that has been prepared, where they had built up a roadway. So Jeremiah addresses here, saying God's people he says, my people have forgotten me, they've done these things. They, as a result, have caused themselves to stumble. They've caused themselves to stumble because they've gotten off the track. They've gotten off the pathway. They're not on the ancient path. They're not on the old way. They're walking in a way that's not cast up, a way that's not properly prepared. They're stumbling over roots and branches and dead trees that are down across the trail. They're losing their footing. They're trying to get through an area that is not properly prepared. And they have hard going. If you've ever been in a situation like that, and I know that back a couple of years ago or a year and a half ago, we had a camp out for some of the YOU boys up in the Tunica Hills. And prior to going up there, some of you, we've got a few hardy souls here that are survivors of that, who went up there, and not only went up there, they survived and came back to tell the tale. But before they went up there, Terry Richards and I went up there to find out where we were going. And we, in going through there and trying to find out the trails, the one particular area we were trying to go, Mr. Richardson had a topographical map along. When you see him next, you may remind him that he does not know how to read a topographical map, because we got off the track and we got down in an area of very, very rugged terrain, and it was extremely hard going. And at one point we had to use the machete to try and even clear out to make any progress through where we were. And I'll tell you what, when we finally got back on the trail, it was such a relief. Now, it wasn't, the best of a trail, but I'll tell you, by comparison, it was like a 4-lane interstate. It was such a relief to be back on the trail. And you begin to realize how much easier it is when you're walking on the trail, you're walking on the track, you're walking on the path, than when you're off and are maybe trying somehow to get back. Well, it says here, God's people, they say, have forgotten Him. They have caused themselves to stumble in their ways, to get off the old paths, the ancient paths, to walk in paths that a way not cast up, a way not prepared. Now, we see that this ties in with what Jeremiah had said earlier about walking on the old paths and therefore finding rest to our souls, that it is a way of finding rest to be in the old paths. Jesus said to come to Him, and He would give us rest from our souls, quoting the statement in Jeremiah. Now, why would Jesus do that? And in what way? Well, we're told in Psalm 23 and verse 3 that the Lord is my shepherd, and that He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. What are the old paths? What are the ancient ways? They're the paths of righteousness. And when we come to Jesus Christ with our load, with our burden, He will lead us in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. That's the direction He's going to lead us. That's the way He's going to lead us. Those are the old paths, the ancient paths. Those are the ones that are easy going. Now let's go on. Let's understand a little more. And why would those be called the easy paths when it seems so hard sometimes to do the things we ought to do? Well, let's understand a little more about this concept of rest and how it ties in with the old paths. In Hebrews chapter 3, before we go to Hebrews, let's go back to Psalm 95. Let's go back to Psalm 95, and then we'll go to Hebrews 3. In Psalm 95, in verse 1, it says, "O come, let us sing unto the Eternal. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." That's, of course, what God commands us to do, to make a joyful noise to Him. That's why we begin our service with song service, because we're continually enjoined to do that. We're told in Psalm 100, verse 4, to enter into His gates with thanksgiving and into His courts with praise. Be thankful to Him and bless His name. We're told to, in fact, in Psalm 100, verse 1 and 2, we're told, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before His presence with singing." Maybe you've wondered, this is just an aside, maybe you've wondered, why do we always begin God's Sabbath service with singing? Because God says, come before His presence with singing. That's the way we're to come before Him. So that's why we do it. Now, He doesn't say you have to be able to carry a tune. He just says make a joyful noise, which is very good because some of us would be in trouble if anything else was required. Well, in Psalm 95, he says, let us sing to the Lord, make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before His presence with thanksgiving and make a joyful noise unto Him with psalms. That's why we sing the psalms. It's usually one of the first things that people notice that come into God's church is the songbook is different. I remember that was one of the first things I noticed when I first attended services. The songs were not the ones that I was used to singing. And of course, probably weren't the ones you were used to singing. Well, we're told to make a joyful noise unto Him with psalms. For the eternal is a great God and a great King above all gods. In His hand are the deep places of the earth. The strength of the hills is His also. The sea is His. He made it. His hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the eternal, our Maker. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture and the sheep of His hand. Today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your heart, as in the provocation and as in the day of temptation in the wilderness. Now, the reference here is back to the book of Numbers, in the book of Exodus, to an account that took place described as Meribah and Massah. The provocation and the temptation in the wilderness. He says, today if you'll hear His voice, don't harden your heart, as Israel of old did at Meribah and Massah, in the provocation and the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their hearts, and they have not known my ways, unto whom I swore in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. Now Jesus said, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Here's a group of people to whom God said, you will not enter into my rest. Why weren't they going to enter into God's rest? Because they hardened their hearts. They tempted God. They provoked God. He put up with them for 40 years. They continued to err in their hearts. They never really knew God's ways, God's paths. They weren't seeking to follow those paths. They wanted to go their own way. And I said, God says here through the pen of the psalmist David, they will not enter into my rest. Now let's go back to Hebrews 3 and let's see if we notice something familiar. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 7, wherefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you will hear His voice, harden not your heart as in the provocation in the day of temptation in the wilderness. When your fathers tempted me, proved me, saw my works 40 years, wherefore I was grieved with that generation, and said, they do always err in their hearts, and they had not known my ways, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. Now you recognize that as being familiar? That's a quotation from Psalm 95. Much of the New Testament is quoted directly out of the Old. Now, notice what Paul quotes it. He says, the Holy Spirit says, this was written by inspiration of God's Spirit. He quotes this section from Psalm 95 that culminates with the lack of Israel entering into God's rest. Then he begins to expound it and explain it. And let's notice his explanation and how it applies to us. In Hebrews 3:12, he says, take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we're made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end, while it is said, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation. So he begins to go through and explain it and expound it. And he said, encourage one another. He said, take heed, lest any of you have an evil heart of unbelief and departing from the living God. You see, what leads us into departing from God is not believing God. Not believing God. We're told to exhort one another, to stir up one another, to encourage one another, to take advantage of doing it on a day-by-day basis, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Recognize that it is a process. Getting off the track is a process. We become hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Sin does not always come in an obvious manner. We're told here that there is a deceitful quality to sin. Because you see, brethren, when we start getting off the track, when we start wandering from the path, usually at the beginning, we just start off a little bit. And we're still fairly close to the path, but we get further and further away. That's why sin is deceitful. When we begin to make compromises in our life with little things, it begins to lead us further and further away. We start out, and this doesn't seem to be a big deal, and that doesn't seem to be a big deal, and we get further and further away. Our heart is hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. You see, at the beginning, our consciences are tender. We're sensitive. But sin is described here in the context as though it kind of sneaks up on us. There's a deceitful quality to it, but gradually, as we practice it, we get more comfortable with it, and our hearts become hardened. We lose that sensitivity. We lose that sensitivity. We start out compromising, kind of edging over here and edging over there, and we lose that sensitivity. Lightning doesn't strike. Some terrible thing doesn't happen. Maybe what we're doing is not of and by itself any gigantic thing. You know, we usually don't start out just direct violation of one of the 10 Commandments. That's usually not the very first step. That is a step along the way. But you see, we start going in that direction. We start being pulled in that direction. So he says, be careful, lest you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. We're partakers of Christ if we hold fast, we hold on the confidence that we started with. We start out with a confidence in Jesus Christ and in God the Father, and we've got to hold on to that confidence to the end. We start out with a confidence, we have to hold on to it. While it is said today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart, as the ancient Israelites of old did. For some, when they heard, verse 16, they provoked God. Not all of them that came out of Egypt with Moses did, but most of them did. With whom was he grieved 40 years? With whom was God grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness, to whom he swore that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So you see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Now, what did it mean to enter into God's rest? What was that expression meaning to Israel of old? They had been in Egypt. Their burden was heavy. Their yoke was hard. They were yoked under the driving whip of a harsh taskmaster. They were made, as it were, to make bricks without straw. They were tired. They were having to labor in a very difficult, adverse way. They were in difficult straits. They had no rest in Egypt. God brought them out of Egypt, and He started leading them through the wilderness to the Promised Land. Now, during that transition from Egypt to the Promised Land, they were out from under the taskmasters of Egypt, but they didn't have rest. They were setting up camp and taking down camp and walking and setting up camp and taking down camp and walking a little further and setting up camp and taking down camp and walking a little further. How you get a lot of rest doing that, do you? You probably get real good at it, I'll say that, but you get a lot of practice putting up and down tents. But it's not a real restful existence. You never get to stay in one spot very long. Well, the reason was what God proposed to give them was not the Sinai wilderness. It was not Egypt. It was not the Sinai wilderness. What He proposed to give them was a land flowing with milk and honey. A land on the other side of the Jordan River. And so He led them. And they came up within sight of the Promised Land. They sent in 12 spies to go in and spy out the land and to come back and tell them what was there. And the spies came back and they said, all that God told us about this land is absolutely true. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. And they described it. You know, they even brought back some of the fruit. It talks about a bunch of grapes that they brought back, that this cluster of grapes was so gigantic that it took two of them to carry it. They had to tie it to a stick and carry it on their shoulders. I've never seen a cluster of grapes that big. I doubt any of them ever had either. They were so impressed with it, they brought it back to show them. So he said, now, it is exactly what God said. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. But there are giants in the land. There are problems, there are difficulties, there are adversaries. There are all kinds of things we're going to face if we cross the Jordan River and go into the land. We can't go where God is taking us because we'll die if we do. You know the story. Well, what did the people do? Except for Joshua and Caleb, they believed the 10 spies. Two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, told them the truth. They said, look, we follow God. There's no problem. We're well able to do it. God will see to it. You see, who did not enter into God's rest? Because when they came, the idea was, the promise was, you come into the promised land and you will inherit a fixed abiding place. You'll be able to settle down. You'll have rest from enemies around about. You'll have peace. You'll have a place where you live, a place where you can raise your family, where you can farm, where you can do these things. You'll finally have a place of your own. You'll have something that's yours. You'll be able to settle down. You won't be a sojourner in an enemy country. You won't be a sojourner coming through a hostile wilderness. You will have inherited the land that I promised to your ancestor Abraham. A land flowing with milk and honey. Now, who was it that He told them would not enter into that rest? Those that didn't believe Him. See, they couldn't enter in because of unbelief. That's why they didn't cross the Jordan, because they didn't believe God. And because they didn't believe God, they were afraid to go where God led. They got off the track. They got off the path. They didn't follow the path that the Lord, who was their shepherd, led them in. It was a matter of the sheep following the goats instead of the shepherd. And they got lost. They wound up in the wilderness and they died. Now, Paul goes on in Hebrews 4. He said, "Let us therefore fear, lest the promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it." They had a promise of entering into God's rest, and those of that generation that came out of Egypt didn't. Why not? Because they didn't believe God. They did not take God at his word. And because of that, they didn't cross the Jordan River. They didn't follow where God led, because their unbelief paralyzed them, panicked them. Their faith gave way to fear. It was unbelief. They didn't enter in. Now, we need to be careful, because God gives to us a promise of entering into his rest, and we need to be careful lest any of us should come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. They had good news given to them. The good news of an establishment of a physical kingdom of God on the earth. The physical nation of Israel being established as a physical kingdom. The good news established to us, preached to us, of God's kingdom going to be established. But you see, the word preached did not profit them. The reason it was of no value to them was because it wasn't mixed with faith in them that heard it. Hearing the word is of no value if you don't believe the word. No warning is of any value if you don't believe it. For he said, for we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he spoke in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his labors. In this place again, in Psalm 95 again, if they shall enter into my rest. Now, here there begins a kind of a play on words. You see, the Sabbath, we're told here, is a type. We begin to get into a type, into types. And this is important to realize that much of the Old Testament was written down really as an example, as a type, as an illustration for us. You see, that's what we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. These things were our examples to the intent we should not lust after evil things. Now, if you get the context of 1 Corinthians 10, it's about the Exodus and Israel's going through the wilderness. In verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 10, all these things happened unto them for examples. They're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. So we're told that the things that happened to them were examples, or the marginal rendering here in my Bible, by verse 11, by examples, the marginal rendering is types. All these things happened unto them for types, for illustrations. They were things that spiritual lessons are to be learned by us from. Now, Paul begins to get into a type here in Hebrews chapter 4. He said God is talking about entering into rest, entering into his rest. Now, God's works were finished from the foundation of the world. You remember back in Genesis 1 how he spoke in a certain place, back in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, of the seventh day in this way. How that God did rest the seventh day from all his works. You read that back in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1. God made the heavens and the earth, and then God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So the Sabbath then is God's day of rest. It's the day he tells us to rest. He first rested on that day, sanctified it, made it holy. Later on, in Psalm 95, he's speaking again of ancient Israel, if they shall enter into my rest. Seeing, therefore, it remains that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Now, the point that Paul is making here is that the rest that God is talking about went beyond the physical inheritance of the promised land. The physical inheritance of the promised land by Israel of old was in itself a type. It was a type, an illustration of something. The proof that Paul has for that is that he says in Psalm 95, he quotes here Psalm 95. And in verse 6, he says, "Seeing therefore it remains that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief." Again, he limits a certain day, saying in David. That's, by the way, how I knew that Psalm 95 was written by David. It doesn't say that in Psalm 95. You can go back and read. A lot of the Psalms have a superscription, tell you who it was written by. When I read it earlier, I mentioned the psalmist David. You may have wondered how I knew that. The reason I know that is because Paul said so right here. And in Hebrews 4, verse 7, he limits a certain place, saying in David. Through David, today, after so long a time, as it is said today, if you'll hear his voice, harden not your heart. See, he goes back and he's quoting again from Psalm 95. Going back and quoting from Psalm 95. If you'll hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Jesus, and actually Joshua is the sense of it, Jesus is the Greek form of the Hebrew word Joshua. Of course, Jesus is actually the English form of the Greek form of the Hebrew form. Different languages spell even the same word differently. For instance, in English, if we want to put if we want to denote ownership, we would say that it is either John's house or it is the house of John, and either way denotes ownership. In French, you can only show it one way. Maison de Jean. You don't have the apostrophe s. It would be the house of John. Well, in Greek, there is you instead of even a preposition, you simply put a different ending at the end of the word. So the spelling. Some people have made a great deal of trying to pronounce the words. The Hebrew language. There's even a whole church that has grown up called a Sacred Names movement. Makes a big issue of the fact that I said, well, you shouldn't say Jesus for the Savior's name, because that was not what was said back then. Well, it's a matter simply of Jesus is the way we pronounce it in English. You don't pronounce it that way in French. You don't pronounce it that way in Spanish. You don't pronounce it that way in Greek. Each language pronounces the word a little differently. That's the nature of things. And in certain languages, such as Greek, every time every way that a word is used in a sentence, every way that a noun is used in a sentence, you have a different ending to show ownership, to show whether it's the subject of the sentence or the direct object or whatever it may be. So it's simply the very nature of the languages. The difference in languages means there's going to be different spellings and different pronunciations. Now, Joshua was the original form here, and in this context, in verse 8, the reference is not to Jesus the Messiah, it is to Joshua of old. Most modern translations will bring that out. In the Greek language, their names are the same. See, in the Greek language, it's the same, but the reference in the context is not to Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ, it is to Joshua. Because he said, Paul quotes David in the Psalm 95 as saying, today after so long a time, as it is said, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? You see, Joshua did lead a generation of Israelites into the promised land. They spent 6 years subduing the land, and in the 7th year, the first sabbatical year, they entered into rest. The land was at rest. They had peace from their enemies. Everything was at rest. They entered into rest in a physical sense. They settled down. They were no longer on the move. They had a fixed place to live. And they had peace from all their adversaries. Now, was that the ultimate fulfillment of the promise of entering into God's rest? Was that what everything, all of the scriptures were focused upon? Was Joshua leading them in, subduing the land, and finally settling them? No. What Joshua did was a type of something else. Paul's proof of that is that 400 years after Joshua had given them rest in the promised land, after Joshua had brought them into the promised land, that 400 years later, David, writing in the Psalms, said, "Today, after so long a time, if you will hear his voice," if denotes something that is conditional, that can happen in the future. If you're going to enter. When you speak of if, you're talking about future. You're not talking about past. So Paul says, look, the ultimate fulfillment of entering into God's rest was not Joshua leading them into the promised land, because he wouldn't have 400 referred to another time of if you will enter into my rest. See, David is writing 400 years later, and he's talking about entering into God's rest future tense. So obviously what Joshua did was not the ultimate fulfillment. So Paul goes through and expounds that out of Psalm 95. So he says in verse 7, Joshua had given them rest. Then would God not afterward have spoken of another day of rest, another day, another time of entering into God's rest 400 years later through David, if what Joshua did was the ultimate fulfillment of that? There remains, verse 9, therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entering into his rest, he has also ceased from his own works as God did from his. Now, one other thing that is not apparent here as we go through, the translators obscured something here in verse 9. If your Bible has marginal notes, you may notice that there's a little number out by the word rest in verse 9. What you don't get from reading most English translations is that the word for rest in verse 9 is a totally different word than is translated rest throughout everywhere else in Hebrews 3 and 4. Throughout the rest of Hebrews 3 and 4, everywhere you read the word rest, it is the Greek word kataposos, which means literally to rest. But in Hebrews 4:9, the word that's translated rest here is the word sabbatismos. Now, you don't have to be a Greek scholar to know sabbatismos sounds something like Sabbath. And it must have something to do with the Sabbath. You don't have to be a Greek scholar to figure that one out. Sabbatismos. Well, that's exactly what it means. It means, literally, sabbatismos means a Sabbath keeping. A Sabbath keeping. There remains, therefore, a Sabbath keeping to the people of God. For he that's entering into God's rest, he's also ceased from his own works as God did from his. When did God cease from his works? God ceased from his works at the end of the 6th day. And he rested on the 7th. And if we're entering into God's rest, what Joshua led them into was only a type. You see, what Joshua led them into was a type of entering into the kingdom of God. What Joshua led them into was a type of the kingdom of God. And if we're entering into the rest of what Joshua did was a type, we're really entering into the kingdom of God. And what are we going to be doing? We're going to be resting from our own works. We're going to cease doing our own thing. We're going to cease from our own works, just like God did from his works. In other words, we're going to be keeping the Sabbath. There remains a Sabbath keeping to the people of God. Interesting. A lot of people don't think that the New Testament teaches about the Sabbath. Well, it teaches about the Sabbath in many places. And right here, there remains a Sabbath keeping to the people of God, because every week when we observe God's Sabbath, it is both a memorial of creation, of the time when God rested and sanctified and set apart a particular day as his, is different. It is a memorial of creation, but it is also an indication of something yet future. Because the weekly Sabbath is a type of the time when the kingdom of God will hold sway on this earth. It is a type of the time of the Messiah. It reminds us that we will ultimately enter into God's rest. When we cease from our own labors every week as God did, we are therefore looking forward to the time when we will cease from our labors as human beings, just as Israel looked forward to a time when they would cease through their labors of traversing the wilderness and enter into the promised land and inherit God's promises. We are reminded every week as we keep the Sabbath that this time of travail, this time of difficulty, this time of adversity, this time of a hard road, this time of all of the things that we go through and all of the distances we have to traverse, that those are temporary, they're coming to an end, that our temporary circumstances are just that. They are temporary. That just as sure as the sun is going to set on Friday and the Sabbath is going to begin. How sure can something be? You know, no matter what's going on during the week, no matter what you're facing on Monday and Tuesday, no matter how rough the going gets, no matter how hard you're having to work, one thing you know, and that is the fact that ultimately the sun is going to set on Friday afternoon. And when it does, the day of God's rest will begin. And whatever it is you've been doing, you can stop. And you can rest. And God gives us the Sabbath as a reminder. That's how sure it is that the kingdom of God is going to be established. That's how sure it is that Jesus Christ is going to return. Just as sure as the setting of Friday's sun, that's how sure it is that Jesus Christ is going to return. So, there remains, therefore, a Sabbath keeping to the people of God. It's important that God's people keep the Sabbath because a Sabbath keeping reminds us of the rest into which we will enter as God's people. And if we're entering into God's rest, we're going to be ceasing from our works, same as God did from His. Every Friday afternoon, we're going to be keeping God's Sabbath. We're told, therefore, let us labor to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Now, let's go back to the book of Deuteronomy. I want to focus our attention just a little bit. We're not going to at all go through the whole book, but I want to focus in on certain key chapters here, because what we have in the book of Deuteronomy are the words that Moses spoke to the generation that was on the threshold of entering into God's rest. So I would ask you the question, on the threshold of entering into God's rest, upon what should our minds be focused? On the threshold of entering into God's rest, where do we need to focus our mind, our attention? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 3, if you remember the story, and I'll just briefly recap, they had, of course, come up within sight of the Jordan River. Now, when they did, 2.5 tribes, Reuben and Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh, of course, was the only tribe that couldn't get along with itself. That's why they split into half tribes, and half of them settled on one side of the Jordan River. The other half went on over to the other side of the Jordan River. And so they were counted as one tribe. They never ceased to be one tribe, but there was friction. There was a certain friction that existed there, and so half of them wanted the inheritance on one side of the river, and the other half went on over to the other, and they separated, even though they remained as one tribe. It's interesting when you study the history of this nation, and you see the extent to which, literally, from the founding of the very first 2 permanent settlements in this country, beginning in Jamestown, Virginia, and then just a few years later in Plymouth, Massachusetts, you see that there has been clearly a distinction between 2 half-tribes of Manasseh that have remained one nation but have never gotten along with itself. And you find it way back here. It goes back to the fact that Manasseh had children by a wife and by a concubine, and there was difficulty in the family in terms of inheritance way back then, and there have been certain things that came on down. Old sins cast long shadows. And the Jew-Arab conflict in the Middle East is another indication of that. It goes back to family problems in the family of Abraham. And so we find some of these things that go way back. But anyway, they came up within sight of the Jordan River, ready to cross over. And Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh wanted to settle on the east side of the Jordan River. Now, technically, the promised land, where Moses was going to lead them to start them out, was on the west side of the Jordan River. But they said, look, we like this area here on the east bank, and we would like to go ahead and have that. And Moses at first thought they were trying to get out of crossing the Jordan and helping the other tribes subdue the land. And they said, no, not at all. That's not what we're trying to do. We'll leave our women and children here and settle them in. But we will go forward. In fact, we'll be glad to be the leaders and to go forward as the head of the army. We want to do our part. We're not trying to slack from that. We just would like this area right here on this side of the Jordan. And Moses said, that's fine. So notice here in Deuteronomy 3, in verse 18, Moses is rehearsing the history of what had gone before. And in verse 18 of Deuteronomy 3, he says, I commanded you at that time, saying, the Eternal your God has given you this land to possess it. You shall pass over armed before your brethren, the children of Israel, all that are fit for war. So this is what he told Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Your wives and your little ones and your cattle, for I know you have much cattle, shall abide in your cities, which I have given you, until the Lord has given rest unto your brethren as well as unto you, and until they also possess the land, which the Eternal your God shall give them beyond Jordan. And then shall you return every man to his possession, which I have commanded you. And I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done unto these two kings, so shall the Lord do to all the kingdoms where you pass. You shall not fear them, for the Lord your God, he shall fight for you. Now notice in verse 20, they were told to go before the other Israelites until God has given rest unto your brethren as well as unto you. So he talks here about Joshua leading them in, Joshua giving them rest, leading them in, and when they had gotten rid of the opposing forces, the thing that which stood between them and the inheritance of God's promises, when they had finally traversed that, they would enter into rest. Now that's what all of Psalm 95 and Hebrews 3 and 4 were talking about in developing that analogy, that example, to teach us certain spiritual lessons. Now, as they're preparing, as they're on the threshold of entering into God's rest, Moses addresses certain subjects. And the next time you study the book of Deuteronomy, study it from the standpoint, this is what the people of God need to have their attention on as they stand on the threshold of entering into God's rest. Moses went back and he recapitulated what had happened, and he placed emphasis in certain areas. The book of Deuteronomy is quoted over 80 times in the New Testament. Only the books of Psalms and Isaiah are quoted more. Book of Psalms, then the book of Isaiah, then the book of Deuteronomy in terms of the most frequent quotation, frequency of quotation in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament from the Old. Is very frequently quoted. Now, let's notice here. What does he tell them? As Moses says, now look, you're on the threshold of entering in and ultimately entering into God's rest. In chapter 4, he says, now listen, hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you for to do them, that you may live and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers gives you. You shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish aught from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Eternal your God which I command you. So he said, look, Keep the law. Walk in God's ways. Keep God's commandments and His statutes and His judgments. Do the things that God says. Don't add to it. Don't take away from it. Don't do your own thing. Don't go your own way. In verse 7, what nation is there so great that has God so near to them as the eternal our God? He is in all things that we call upon Him for. What nation is there so great that has statutes and judgments so righteous as this law which I set before you this day? Only take heed to yourselves and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen and you depart from your heart all the days of your life. But teach these things to your sons and your sons' sons. He says, don't lose sight of what you've learned. Preserve that knowledge. Preserve it from generation to generation. Remember the basis of God's revelation, which is, verse 13, He declared unto you His covenant, which He commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments. And He wrote them on 2 tables of stone. And then the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments, that you might do them in the land you go to possess. So He said, remember the 10 commandments. And teach those things to your children. That's the starting point of God's law. Then He said, and He reminds the people the importance of doing that and of teaching and transmitting those things from generation to generation. That's crucial. Because it is necessary that lessons learned from one generation be transmitted to the next. It's one of the tragedies in modern families that very little conversation and real communication take place. In many cases, even physical lessons that people have learned of life, lessons don't get transmitted. We find ourselves economically at the threshold of the kind of collapse that occurred in the early part of this century. You know, the generation that remembers the Depression and all of the greed that was so characteristic of the roaring 20s, the lesson has failed to be transmitted. We have another generation making the same mistakes that a predecessor did. And you know, you plant the same seed, you reap the same crop. Amazing how that keeps working. You know, you keep going back and you plant the same seed, you keep getting the same crop to come up. It just happens that way. It's very important that lessons be transmitted from one generation to another if progress is going to be cumulative, rather than each one having to go back and make so many of the same old mistakes. Talks here about God's law and transmitting that. In verse 40 he says, you shall keep therefore His statutes, His commandments, which I command you this day, that it may go well with you and your children after you, that you may prolong your days upon the earth, which the eternal your God gives you forever. You want to live forever? You want to prolong your days upon the earth? Both the days of our nation upon the earth, the days in the extension of the family. This can be, verse 40 can be taken 2 ways. Jesus quoted it one way in the New Testament when the young man came to Him, you know, inquiring, what good thing shall I do? And He said, if you will enter into life, keep the commandments. Well, this is a paraphrase of Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 40, or Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 40. It could also be understood just strictly in the physical sense, that as long as Israel continued to do those things, their days upon the land, the days of the nation upon the land, would continue to extend, because they would continue to have God's blessing. So then we come on down, and in chapter 5, Moses rehearses the 10 Commandments. He goes through and he just enumerates them and names them out, goes right down the line, reminds them of what they were. And in verse 29 of Deuteronomy 5, he says, oh, that there were such a heart in them that they would fear me and keep my commandments. I wish they were converted. I wish they had the heart and mind to do what I said. So in chapter 6 it goes on that these are the commandments and the statutes and the judgments, verse 1. You're to fear the eternal your God, verse 2, and keep these things. And in verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently unto your children. It's to be transmitted as precious knowledge. Verse 24, the Lord commanded us to do these statutes, to fear the eternal our God, for our good always, that He may be able to preserve us alive as it is this day. God's law is for our good. The paths of righteousness are the paths that lead to rest. Come unto me, all you that labor, that are heavy laden. I will give you rest. I will show you how to enter into rest. I'll show you how to get out from under the travail and the difficulty. I will lead you into rest. The rest that Joshua led Israel of old into was only a type of the rest that Jesus Christ promises to lead His people into. It was a type, an illustration of the ultimate rest that we can inherit as the people of God. Now, many of those who started out on that trek did not enter into the rest that Joshua gave them because they didn't believe and they didn't keep following in the path that led to rest. The old path, the ancient path. The reason it's called old and ancient is because it is the pathway of God's law. And God is the Ancient of Days. And God's Word is true from the beginning. True from the beginning. God's ways are eternal. They're a reflection of His nature and His character. You can't get any older and more ancient than something that has always been. And the paths of righteousness are the paths that reflect the way of God. God Himself is the trailblazer. Jesus said, Come unto me, all you that labor, that are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Now here is Moses admonishing them as they stand on the threshold of following Joshua of old into physical rest. These things are preserved and recorded for us, that as we stand on the threshold of entering into the spiritual rest, the real rest, the rest of which David prophesied in Psalm 95, of which Paul commented in Hebrews 3 and 4, as we stand on the threshold, our attention needs also to be directed back to these admonitions given to a people on the threshold of entering into rest. A reminder of God's law, that it's for our good. Chapter 7 focuses in on the specialness. God was preparing to lead Israel in chapter 7, verse 1, Eternal your God shall bring you into a land where you go to possess it, and He'll cast out many nations before you. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Eternal your God shall deliver them before you, you shall utterly smite them. Verse 3, neither shall you make marriages with them. Your daughter shall you not give, nor take their daughter for your son, for they will turn you away from following me. Verse 5, to destroy their altars. Verse 11, you are to keep my commandments, statutes, and judgments. If you do these things, you'll be blessed. Verse 14, above all people. And God would fight our battles for us. He said in verse 25, the graven images of their gods you're to burn with fire. Don't covet the gold and the silver on their little idols and statues. Don't take it to you. Verse 26, don't bring these abominations into your house, lest you be cursed like them. But you hate it. It's a cursed thing. You know, it's not some cute little trinket to kind of sit up there and look at and think, oh, isn't that nice? God says, look, He says, I absolutely hate it and despise it, because I know the heartache that it has caused to human beings made in my image. Every abomination that is imaginable has been done under the auspices of these idols that these nations worship. Everything imaginable. These are abominable things. And you need to view it the way I view it. He goes on down in chapter 8, and he says, these things I'm giving you to do. He says, verse 2, remember the 40 years. Remember the trial and testing that brought you from Egypt to the promised land. Remember the years of travel that brought you from Egypt to the promised land. Why were those 40 years? Trial and testing. Verse 2 says, to humble you and to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. That's ultimately what God wants to find out in our lives. What would you do? If you had the opportunity to do anything you wanted, what would it be? See, if you could do anything you wanted to do, what would you do? Would you be just like God? If you were given the power to do anything you wanted to do, what would you do? Would you use that power to be just exactly like God? Or would you go off in another direction to do other things because you never thought you could get by with them before? You know, that is the key. That's what conversion is all about. It's a transformation on the inside in our mind, learning to think a different way. You know, we went through and this past Bible study in the book of Ezekiel, where it talked about the fact that Israel of old did not leave Egypt in their hearts. You know, in the book of Ezekiel, we talked about how that God says Israel did not really leave Egypt. In Ezekiel 20, verse 8, they rebelled against me. They wouldn't hearken. They didn't cast away the abomination of their eyes, neither did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Well, the real meaning of that is emphasized in Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 in verse 39, to whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them, speaking of Christ, and in their hearts turned back again to Egypt. In their hearts they turned back. Even though they didn't physically get to turn back and go back to Egypt, in their hearts they never left Egypt behind. It is important for us that in our hearts we forsake Egypt. What would you like to go back to? What have you left behind that you wish you could get back? See, God says, I let you wander, in Deuteronomy 8, to prove you. I wanted to humble you and I wanted to prove you. I wanted to know what was in your heart. Why did God leave Moses up in the mountain 40 days getting the tables of stone? People had made a covenant with God. Moses went up in the mountain to get the tables of stone. Why did he stay up there 40 days? Well, it gave time enough for the people to prove what was in their heart. You know what was in their heart? A golden calf. See, they didn't physically bring a golden calf out of Egypt with them, but they remembered the golden calf. And when nobody was looking, specifically Moses, when Moses wasn't there, they said, you know, wouldn't it be nice to have a golden calf again? So they made one, just like they remembered they used to have. And Moses waited just long enough, you see. God brought him down at just the right time. If Moses had been there, they would have never built the golden calf, would they? Because Moses wouldn't have let them. Moses wouldn't have let them. God is going to give you and me the opportunity to prove what's in our heart. What's in our heart? What is it we want to do? What part of Egypt have we brought with us in our hearts? What would we like to turn back to? What golden calf would we like to construct? God's going to give us an opportunity. If we still have a golden calf in our heart that we would like to construct, God's going to give us the opportunity. You know, the lesson of Balaam we saw in the book of Numbers is that God many times permits. What God permits and what God approves are two different things. God permitted Balaam to leave, but God didn't approve of it, and He really made it plain. He even used Balaam's donkey to tell him what a fool he was. The donkey had more sense than Balaam, because when the angel blocked the way, the donkey stopped. When God blocked the way for Balaam, Balaam looked for a way to get around it. God permitted Balaam to go, and Balaam wound up dead too. You know, go through and read the story in the book of Numbers. God permitted it, but He didn't approve of it. Don't ever confuse the two. God is going to permit us to prove what's in our heart. Provides circumstances. Because ultimately that's what God's after. That's what Christianity and conversion is all about. It is a transformation of the inner man. It's not just external conformity with rules that are imposed upon us by somebody who's standing there watching is going to get us if we don't. You can go along and never rebel against the rules and conform to whatever is imposed and never be converted. All you are is compliant. There's a difference between compliance and conversion. That's better to be compliant than to be a rebel, but neither one is conversion. Conversion is an inner transformation, an inner change, a surrender of our will, where with our heart and our mind we want something else. We want the way of God and the will of God. We want to follow in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Not to see how close to the edge of the cliff we can get. Not to see how much we can get over, you know, how close can we get off the track. So God reminded them in chapter 8 the importance of looking to Him. Talked about conversion in chapter 10, verse 16. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be no more stiff-necked. Verse 11, or chapter 11, verse 1. Love the Lord your God, keep His charge, His statutes, His judgments, and His commandments. Verse 16. Take heed to yourselves, your heart be not deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods. Verse 19, teach these things to your children. Speak of them when you sit down, when you walk in the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Verse 22, you're to diligently keep all these commandments. Chapter 12 says these are the things you're to do. And then he talks about the festival and bringing the tithes and coming before God in verse 11 in the place that He chooses to place His name there. We're to go, verse 14, to the place God has chosen. We're to respect God's government and where God is working. And let's conclude in verse 30 and 31 and 32. The snare that God warns us of. Take heed to yourself that you be not snared by following them, after they be destroyed from before you, and that you inquire not after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. You know, people look around at the various customs. They look around at various pagan customs and they say, but we don't do it for this reason. You know, that's not why we do it. People don't put up Christmas trees because they're trying to worship Baal. At least I've never met anybody that did. Back years ago when I used to do it, I had no idea. I wasn't doing that to try to worship Baal. I wasn't trying to do that to worship the sun god. I wasn't doing that for any of those reasons. I thought, you know, it's nice, it's pretty, it looks nice. Everybody else does it. Isn't it pretty? Everybody does it, and you know, we're celebrating Christ's birthday, right? Now find me any place in the Bible where anybody ever celebrated Christ's birthday. Find me any place in the Bible where Christ ever celebrated His own birthday. You ever read, you know, He had a big whoop-de-doo and had, you ever read that? You ever read where Peter and Paul and all of them got together and said, let's celebrate Christ's birthday, and we'll do it by giving presents to one another and putting up a tree like the Romans do. You don't ever find that. You don't find them celebrating Christ's birthday. In fact, you don't find even the professing Christian church, even the Catholic Church, celebrating it for over 300 years. Then they took a Roman holiday, Saturnalia, which at the point after Constantine's, quote, conversion to Catholicism, his choosing the brand of Christianity promulgated by the Bishop of Rome and deciding to make that the standard form throughout the empire, to make that the universal church, taking the church at Rome and using that as a basis of a universal church, because the old Roman religion had lost its appeal and lost its credibility, and there needed to be something to give the empire cohesiveness. So Constantine took, because the various heresies that had rent the church in the latter first century and in the second century and on into the third century, had split and splintered the professing Christian world into many various heretical movements. There was a confusion of heresies. Constantine embraced the particular heresy promulgated at Rome, and he called that, standardized that. He says, this is going to be standard brand. We're going to make this the universal church. That's what Catholic means, by the way, is universal. So he took the church at Rome and he says, we're going to make this standard. We're going to make this universal. He called the Nicene Council, over which he himself presided, and he hadn't even been sprinkled yet. But he presided over the council at Nicaea and made decisions to standardize doctrine. And in the process of this, one of the things that was addressed, that if a religion was going to be popular with the Roman populace, it had to adopt things they were already familiar with. It had to compromise and make concessions. If you're going to be popular with the world, you've got to be more like the world. So they said, look, let's take some of these holidays. Let's take Saturnalia, which is the most popular Roman holiday. Let's let's try to kind of clean it up a little bit. Get rid of some of the worst customs. The things that are a little more flagrant. Let's try to play down those and kind of clean it up a little bit. And we will change the name of it. And we will teach the people to do it in honor of Christ. They can keep on doing what they've been doing, following the same customs, but now they'll do it for a different reason. And this way, they will be amenable to making the change, you see, to Christianity. So this seemed like a good idea, and that's what they did. That's why you find it was the mid-4th century before you ever find record of Christmas being celebrated at Rome as Christmas. Now, that seemed like a good idea. It seemed reasonable. And people have continued to do it all on down. Though many of the early Protestant reformers recognized its origin. There was a time when it was proscribed by law in England and in portions of the United States. It didn't even become a legal holiday in Massachusetts until the 1840s. So it's not, the universal American custom. In fact, George Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas and defeated the British there in a very major battle because he knew that the German troops, the Hessians, made a big deal out of Christmas, and they'd all be drunk, and it would be a good opportunity to attack. And so actually played a crucial portion in the history of this country because of those who observed it and those who didn't. But anyway, that's just an aside. But he says, take heed to yourselves. Don't be snared by following after them. Don't inquire after them, saying, how did they serve their God? Even so will I do likewise. Don't do so unto the Lord your God. See, God doesn't want you to serve Him the way they serve their gods. People will tell you that they're doing things, well, we don't do it for that reason. We're not doing it to worship the sun god, or we're not doing it to do this or to do that, whether it's, any of these various things. Easter, you take your pick. We're not doing it for those reasons, they say. And they're not. They're not. They're doing it because it looks pretty. They're doing it because everybody else does it. They're doing it because they think it's nice, and we'll do it for God. But brethren, God tells us He wants to be worshiped in sincerity and truth. He wants us to serve Him the way He tells us to serve Him. He doesn't want us looking around and getting good ideas from the world and say, well, why don't we do this for God? Don't do so to the Lord your God. Every abomination that He hates have they done to their gods. These things are all tangled up with all the things they've done. God says, I don't like it. So whatever I tell you to do, observe to do it. Don't add to it. Don't take away from it. So God warned His people, don't edge toward the world. Don't try to blend in and be part and parcel of the world. Don't try to look like, act like, be like, blend in with, be part and parcel of this world and this society, adopting its customs and kind of cleaning them up a little bit, shining them up. Don't do that. Take heed to yourself. Don't be snared. Don't be trapped. Don't get off the track. So we stand on the threshold of entering into the promised land. We stand on the threshold of entering into God's rest. But we have to be reminded and admonished. Here are the words that God gave through Moses to a people on the threshold of entering into God's rest. Here are words that are preserved for us today, a people on the threshold of entering into God's rest. That when we understand it, these are words that talk about a new covenant being written in our hearts and in our minds. A transformation of the way we think. But you see, right now, we're still in the period of the book of Numbers. We're still traversing the wilderness. We haven't yet entered into God's rest. We're in that period where we're being proven and tested, as well as humbled. We're having to recognize our dependence upon God. We're also put in a position to demonstrate what's really in our heart. What do we really want? What do you look back on? What do you want to bring with you? What is it out of Egypt that you would like to take with you? God doesn't want Egypt brought into the promised land. We need to look at our lives. We need to look at the changes that we make. And these changes need to take us in the direction of being more like God. Change and transformation is very important. But it needs to be taking us in the paths of righteousness. It needs to be taking us away from this world and its corrupt values and its faulty values and its approach. And it needs to be taking us in the direction of God, in His way, in His promised land. Jesus said, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Yes, He will. He will lead us in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And those are the old paths, the ancient paths, because they're the paths of God's law. They're the paths that reflect the mind of God from the time of eternity, the time before time. That's why they're old, they're ancient. They're a reflection of God Himself, the paths of righteousness, and He will lead us in those paths for His name's sake. And those are the paths that lead to rest. We have before us the opportunity to enter in to God's rest, not to be deterred because of unbelief, but to trust God and to follow God and to inherit the promises of God.